Good morning. Today is the 30th day of Shvat, Rosh Chodesh Adar, the first day of Rosh Chodesh, and it's also the 21st of February. And we're going to be looking a little bit at the third reading of parashat Terumah. In the third reading, we first of all read about the building or the construction of the Menorah, the candelabra, or candelabrum, I see, and all of its utensils. And then the second part of the reading is about the coverings of the tabernacle. The tabernacle was made, its walls were made out of wood, and the walls of the surrounding courtyard were made out of wood, but the covering was not wood, it was made out of fabrics, different fabrics that were made from different materials that they had in the desert there. And so we'll be looking at those in a moment. One of the interesting things about the menorah, the candelabrum, is that it's very, very complex. In my early years, when I was in my 20s, I used to study with someone by the name of Rabbi Israel Ariel, who heads a place called the Temple Institute. And the Temple Institute was his brainchild, and he studies and develops the different parts of the temple. So for instance, they made a candelabrum. They didn't make it out of pure gold, but they made it out of gold-plated, some kind of metal that was gold-plated, and you can actually see it. It's displayed in Jerusalem. They have a holy museum there in the old city that you can come and visit. You can see many of the utensils of the temple, what they would be like. Actually, the way that they make them is very halachic. It's very according to the legal rulings. So they could actually be used tomorrow if there was a temple. One of the things that he told me about when they made the menorah is that at first they did want to make it out of pure gold. And there's an interesting thing that the Torah says, that it should be made out of one ingot of gold. An ingot is like a amount of gold that's like one solid piece of gold that you're supposed to then fashion into the menorah shape. And an ingot, according to the halachic sources, is 43 kilograms. 43 kilograms of gold. And what they discovered was that you cannot make a 18 hands breadths high menorah out of 43 kilograms of gold, because you would have to make the gold so thin that it would be like aluminum foil, because gold is quite heavy. So to get up to 18 hand breadths, which would be about a meter and a half, the menorah would never be able to survive. It would fold onto itself. The gold would be so thin. So they came to the conclusion that really it's not 43 kilograms of gold, because it simply can't be done physically. And they came to the conclusion that what the Torah is saying is it should just be a piece of gold, and not an ingot, but rather a piece, and not necessarily a particular amount of gold, a certain weight of gold. The reason I'm mentioning all this is because at the very end of Moses being commanded to make the candelabrum, there is a verse that says, "He shall make it together with all these utensils out of 1 talent." And talent is 40. Here writes 48 kilograms, or 106 pounds of pure gold. And like we said, physically it can't be done with that amount of. The next verse says, Moses did not understand. This is what the sages say. Moses did not understand all the details of the instructions how to make the candelabrum. So God showed him the image of a fiery candelabrum and its utensils. He then told him, "Observe their forms that you are being shown on the mountain," meaning in this fiery form of a menorah, "and make them all in that manner." But it was still, the sages say, too complicated for Moses to envision. So God told him he would be able to simply throw the gold into the furnace and it would assume the proper form. So the reason I brought up this whole thing again about the weight and the amount of gold needed to make this vessel is because there's so many problems with it that it's almost impossible to understand how it could be made. And so in the end we have the sages saying that in reality it was impossible to make and it had to be made miraculously. So that in and of itself is a very interesting idea that God would command us to do something, but then it would turn out that this thing that we're commanded to do is so intricate and so difficult that we simply don't have the ability to make it. And what does that actually mean? How can we interpret that psychologically? So the way that Chassidus takes this is that the overall purpose of all the mitzvot that we do with physical objects, for instance, we make a talit with tzitzit, we make tefillin, and we put scrolls in them, and they're written and everything. What we're doing is we're transforming a physical object into a holy object, and more importantly, this object is now meant to spread out, to disseminate divine awareness. Now, I'm, once in a while when I tape myself in the mornings, I already have my tefillin on, and then invariably I get comments from people on YouTube, "What is that on your head?" And the comments are, some of them are ignorant and some of them are not so ignorant, but what they all have in common, and this I've never felt anything differently, is that people resonate in some way that this is something holy. There's something going on with this. This is not like a regular object. And the question is, how is that possible? Just by taking a piece of leather and fashioning into a box and putting scrolls inside, and how did that suddenly become something that has holy value, that has some kind of sacredness to it? So the explanation the Chassidus says is like in the Menorah, that really we don't know, it's not within human means and ability to transform something, a physical object, into something holy. Only God can do that. It's like the Menorah. All you have to do is you have to throw it into the fire. What does it mean? We don't throw the tefillin into the fire, obviously. But psychologically what that means is that if the heart is warm, that the heart is burning with desire and with love, desire for God and love for a fellow man, then the objects themselves are transformed through that fire. And the person who looks at you picks up on it and sees that there's divine awareness being disseminated through these physical objects. So that's the first part of today's reading. The second part is very interesting because this is the source, the third reading of parashat Terumah is the source of a very now well-known word, which most people don't know what its original meaning means. So the word is Kabbalah. What does Kabbalah actually mean? So it shows up in our reading, and you'll see it in chapter 26, verse 5. And I'll read it in English. You shall have them make 50 loops on the one tapestry, and you shall have them make 50 loops along the edge of the tapestry of the second set, each loop being exactly opposite its counterpart. And then if you look in the Vishnevsky Chumash on page 192, so you see basically how they were tied together. So you had one tapestry and another tapestry, and then there were these loops that connected the holes that were made. There's 50 such loops tying the tapestries together. This is on page 192. The word for the loops being exactly opposite one another is makbilot halulaot. The loops are facing one another. They correspond to one another. So you have on one side holes on this side and holes on this side, and these loops tie them together because these holes are exactly one-to-one. They have a one-to-one correspondence, and that's how you put the tapestries together, and these become the coverings of the tabernacle. But the word for corresponding, they correspond to one another, these holes, so that the loops can tie them together, is makbilot. And the word makbilot is the origin, it's the only origin in the entire Torah of this word Kabbalah. So it's a very interesting thing that Kabbalah actually doesn't mean the later meaning that people know, which is to receive something, but Kabbalah actually means to correspond. Things corresponding to one another. What does that mean? It means that the study of Kabbalah is really the art of corresponding models to one another. So for instance, we might have 4 letters of God's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and then we correspond this to many other things that have 4. For instance, the simplest one that comes to mind, the 4 worlds, Atzilut, Bria, Yitzira, Asiyah, or in English, emanation, creation, formation, and action. So the 4 letters of God's name, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, they correspond to these 4 worlds. The same way, you might have that they correspond, the 4 letters, to the 4 types of creatures in the world, what we call the human, the animal life, the vegetable life, and the inanimate. So then again, you have this correspondence. The idea is that you move from one model to another. There's a model that you know better, and there's a model that you know not as well. And by corresponding things one to another, you shed light from what you already know to where you don't know. And that's the essence of Kabbalistic study of the Torah. It's looking for where do we have correspondences like these. So one of the things that comes to mind right away, there are 50 loops here. These 50 loops, they're connecting 50 holes on one tapestry and 50 holes on the other tapestry. What else do we have 50 of? So there are many things in Judaism that have 50. The one that's maybe most well known are what we call the 50 gateways of wisdom, of understanding. I'm having trouble with the translation right now. Chamishim Sha'arei Bina. What are these 50 gateways of understanding? These are 50 ways in which the mind latches onto an idea. And this is a huge topic in Kabbalah to discuss this. It was discussed primarily by Reb Moses Cordovero in his book, The Pardes. But it's a tremendous topic of taking the different 50s and understanding how they represent the ways in which the understanding of the mind works. So you begin to understand that Kabbalah and Chassidut have a very deep understanding of how the mind works. So what are these 50 compared to? They're compared to, for instance, the 50 times, it says in the Talmud that there are 50 times in which the Exodus from Egypt is mentioned in the Pentateuch. Each one of these 50 times represents a different aspect of the Exodus from Egypt, meaning of going from the state of bondage and slavery to going to a state of freedom and the ability to serve God. What this means is that the mind needs to go through all these gateways of understanding in order to truly become free. In other words, there's some learning that's required. It's sort of like you get the mind when you're born and you think you just know what it does, but the truth is it should come with a little label. It says, some assembly required. There's some stuff that you have to actually go through in order to truly light up the mind and come to a deeper understanding of how things work and how you work and how the universe works and so on. So this is the original meaning of Kabbalah, to correspond one model to another. And later on, actually it's also connected to Rosh Chodesh Adar, to the month of Adar, in the Megillah of Esther, in the scroll of Esther, is the first time that we find, I believe it's the first time that we find Kabbalah meaning to receive. as in kimu v'kiblu haYehudim aleim. The Jews accepted, they received the Torah again, and they fulfilled it. So, God willing, we'll see each other again tomorrow, after all 50 gateways of the mind have been opened up to us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov.